Alright guys, so next up is going to be wax resist. So with all these methods, I'm sure you're starting to see a different pattern and a trend of being able to create these really unique different moments in your own artwork. And sometimes there's going to be situations where you either need to block something out or you're going to need to create an effect that you might be looking for. So to block things out, we've already established that we can use tape to kind of section out things, or if we're trying to, again, create a nice crisp line, we use tape. Another thing that you can use to block things out is going to be wax. Now, as you can imagine, wax, this is a colorless wax, so very similar to a crayon, just has no color. And when you apply this to a page, anything that you paint on top of the wax is going to block out the watercolor. So here I did a wax resist, and I did just a simple spiral. When you're doing yours, you don't have to do a spiral. You can do kind of literally anything that you want, but for the ease sake, I'm going to do a spiral for the example. And when you paint over it, you'll see that the paint will want to not stick to where the wax is. Again, it's going to resist from going there, and then you're left with this really cool pattern that you drew on with the wax originally, and then of course you have the nice cool colors that you choose to use. So here I'm going to go ahead and recreate this, and remember, when we're doing this, you can choose any square that you want, and I think I'm going to go ahead and do my wax resist on this square here. So when doing wax resist, you're going to go into your art kit. You're going to find the Ziploc bag with this little square of wax, and here you're going to go ahead and you're going to draw a pattern. So I did a swirl, so I'm just going to go ahead and do the swirl so you can see how it's done, but again, as you're drawing, you can do whatever you'd like. So here, again, I'm going to do a swirl. Now, when you're drawing, it's going to be a little difficult because, as you can imagine, you can't necessarily see it. If you look at it from an angle, you can see the shine from the wax, but as you can imagine, drawing from an angle gets kind of awkward. And so for me, since I want a nice swirl pattern, I have to kind of strategically place these outer lines, because it of course collides with the border, but I still want that illusion as if it's going all the way out. So again, what you choose to draw, how you choose to approach this is kind of up to you. But once you have your pattern drawn, then of course you can go ahead and you can start painting. Before I paint, I like to kind of just wipe off any of the excess flakes of wax that were left on top. Again, that's kind of a preference on you. And so for me, this gives me a nice clean working surface so that I have the best possible outcome. So after you're done with this, you're going to go ahead and you're going to paint. So you can paint one solid color, you can paint multiple colors, you can kind of do whatever you'd like. And so for me, again, I'm going to recreate the one that I did. So I use 3 colors, blue, red, and yellow. And so I'm going to do exactly that. So here, put my palette on the side, get my brush going, and let's start with yellow. So I'm going to take here, I'm going to just start applying some yellow. So quickly you will see that the water does not want to interact with the wax that's on the page. And so as you're painting, it is totally normal if, again, the water is resisting to go in the areas that you marked with your wax square. Transition to a different color. We're going to use red. Just pop some red over here. Now the same effects are going to work if you pre-wet your page with some water already, or if you go in dry with your brush, that's also okay. But again, the more paints, the different effect that you're going to have. Some blue. Voila. So again, as you're going, you know, there's no right, there's no wrong. If you want the colors to kind of interact with each other here, that's up to you. Kind of pop it in there. And voila. You have wax resist. Alright guys, on to technique number 7, the salt technique. Now, again, in your box, there is going to be a small bag of a little bit of salt. You're going to need that for this technique. And then again, like I mentioned, you can do this next technique on any of these squares. So I think I'm going to do mine over here in this top right-hand corner. Now, for this technique, we are going to be going for something like this. So as you see, when you add salt to a freshly painted watercolor piece of paper, the salt interacts with the water and the colors in a way that provides this really cool, really interesting effect. And so most of the time people like to use this effect when they are trying to create galaxies, or honestly just a really cool, interesting background altogether. And so for me, again, I painted it kind of in the similar colors as a galaxy, and the effect looks very different when you use a little bit of salt or a lot of salt. So this one, I used a pretty heavy amount of salt, but for you, again, I want you to start off slow and just kind of see what happens. So the first thing that you're going to do is, of course, you're going to paint your square here. And so when painting, remember, again, you have a bunch of different options. You can paint just straight onto the page without it being pre-wet, or you can wet it first and then paint. Remember that when you do wet it first, it provides a very interesting effect where it allows the water to kind of, or the paint to kind of just bleed into the water and kind of move and do its thing however it wants. But again, when you're painting here, it's kind of up to you, and it could be literally anything. You can use any colors that you'd like. And so, I'm going to go ahead and get this painted real quick, and then we'll be right back. So once you get your section painted, and however you like, you're going to go ahead and open up your bag, and you're going to take a small pinch of salt, and you're going to go ahead and just sprinkle it on top of the work. Now, this effect will only work if the paper is already wet. If it's dry, clearly nothing's going to happen. So you want to make sure that it's freshly painted and that it's still wet when you do this. But again, when you sprinkle the salt in specific areas, the salt reacts with the paint and the water and kind of pushes and pulls it in different ways that give you a really interesting effect. And so, once this dries, we will flake off the salt, and again, we will have a very similar outcome to something like this. Alright guys, next up, number 8, atmospheric perspective. Now, when we are painting, and when we are trying to recreate a scene or a landscape or just something in the room in general, there are different layers to consider and make it feel as if it's going further and further and further back into the scene. Generally speaking, things that are the furthest away are the lightest in color, and things that are the closest to you are the darkest in color. So we are going to go ahead and just paint and recreate mountains, because that is kind of the easiest to start with. But as you kind of develop your art skills, you start to learn that, again, things that are closer to you are a little bit darker and more detail. Things that are further are lighter with less detail. So when we're doing this with watercolor, again, remember, you're going to pick any square that you want, and I have 3 left, so I'm going to do mine down over here. Remember that you do have a variety of different brushes, so don't be afraid to switch brushes as you do each technique. For this one, I am going to go ahead and use my larger round brush, just because, again, I have a bigger area that I'm working with. So the first thing when we're trying to do atmospheric perspective, we want to start with a very, very light wash. So when I say light wash, I mean very little color, a lot more water, so that, again, the first layer is as light as it possibly can be. So you can do this in many ways. What I would suggest is to, again, use your palette so you have the most control that you possibly can. Again, I'm going to be doing mountains, and I'm going to be using brown, but for you, you can use any color that you'd like, and if you want to do different objects, you're more than welcome to. Remember, the concept here is creating different spaces. Again, something that's closer is a little bit darker. Right? Something that's closer is a little bit darker, and as you go further and further back, they get lighter and lighter and lighter. So again, you can draw any objects or shapes that you want, but for this example, I'm going to be drawing mountains. So here, again, I'm going to use the same color just so for ease, but again, you can use any color that you like. We're going to start with, again, our first base. Now, I just put a little bit of color in the well, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to dilute it and add a bunch of water. So again, my first layer is going to be a very light wash to indicate my furthest object, or my furthest scene. And again, it's going to be the lightest wash possible. As you can see, there's barely even any color on the page. So I'm only doing just the top half because everything is going to be layered on top of one another. And so I'm not too concerned with filling the entire page because, again, I'm going to create layers. So before you start your next layer, you're going to want to let this one dry. Now, it doesn't have to be bone dry, but you definitely want to make sure that that all of the water has soaked into the paper and there's nothing pooling or sitting on top of the paper. If you don't let it dry, then of course all your colors are going to bleed into where it's already wet, very similar to the wet on wet technique. So again, before you paint your next layer, just make sure that this one is dry. So we're going to speed it up, we're going to let it dry, and then I will be back for the next layer. Okay, my layer is now dry, and I'm going to go ahead and add the next layer. So you have to work in layers because, of course, if I did it the opposite direction, and if I did dark first and then painted the next layer behind it, it would be extremely difficult to get these nice, crisp, sharp lines. And so, of course, you have to start with your first layer, your furthest distance, your lightest color first, and then you build up on top of that. Again, if we did it roles reverse, it would be impossible to get these nice, sharp, clean lines. So here I have my first wash, my first layer down, which essentially is the furthest object or scene in the thing that you're painting. And so in this case, I'm doing a mountainscape, and so this would technically be the sky, which in theory would be the furthest thing away, so it's the lightest color. So the next color that we're going to put down is going to be the same color, but just a little bit more paint. So here, the first one again was a lot more water, very little paint, and now we're going to start progressively building up and adding a little bit more color or a little bit more paint as we go. Now remember, we have to have some room for growth, and so I don't want to add too much paint because I still want this next wash to be relatively light but a little bit darker than what's already there. So as you're doing this, you're just going to add just a little bit more paint to your well. Now, if it helps you, you can go ahead and take a scrap piece of paper and you can kind of paint down to see what it's going to look like and how it's going to layer up. And I think that this color is going to be perfect. Now, of course, if it's too dark, then you can add more water to your well. If it's too light, then you can add more paint. But of course, you as the artist are going to have to make this determination on how much paint is going to be needed. So here, again, as I'm painting my layers, I will paint now my first set of mountains. So as you're painting, these mountains can be kind of just however you feel is correct. Remember, there is no right or wrong. Remember, you are practicing your skills at this point. Remember, mountains are very kind of inconsistent. They have unique lines and create very interesting shapes when you are observing them. So as you're painting, just kind of let it happen. And so for this layer, we don't necessarily need to paint the entire thing. If you do, there's nothing wrong with that. But here, I'm going to come down to about 3/4 of the page. Because again, remember, the next layer is going to go right on top of this. So there's no need to go all the way down to the bottom. But again, if you do, because that's just how you roll, that's perfectly fine. So here for my mountain, I probably want to just define the line of the mountain just a little bit more clearly. Voila. Second layer down. So again, as I mentioned, you gotta let these layers dry before you add the next one on top. So I'm gonna go ahead and let it dry, and then we're gonna speed this up, and then I'll be right back to do the next layer. Alright guys, my next layer is now dry, and I'm ready for the third layer. So as you can imagine, you can paint as many layers as you want, kind of gradually going from light to your darkest. So for this example, I'm only going to be doing 4 layers. Again, for you, if you want to practice and do more, it's totally up to you. Just remember that after you put 1 layer down, the next layer has to be slightly darker or slightly more pigmented. So you'd add just a little bit more paint to create the break or the difference between each layer. So here again, layer number 1, layer number 2. So my third layer is going to go just right below this set of mountains, and I'm going to make sure that, again, the color is slightly darker than what's already there. So I'm going to take my palette, my mixing palette, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to add a little bit more paint to the well that I already have here. So again, I'm using brown, and I'm just going to add just a little bit more paint. Now, if you need a little bit more water, by all means, remember you're the artist making these decisions, and so get a feel for it. Add more water if you need it. If you don't, then perfect. So here, I added just a little bit more water and some more paint, and I'm going to use my example card, or my test card, just to make sure that I have the right color. Okay. And so here, yes. Just dark enough. It's perfect. So now that I have my appropriate color that I'm looking for, I'm going to go ahead and paint my next layer. So remember again, you're just painting it in the shape of mountains. There's no right, there's no wrong. Again, remember how unique mountains are when you're observing them. They have very interesting lines. They create very interesting shapes, and so you're going to want to recreate that as you're painting. Voila. And so same kind of thing. Remember that you're going to put a 4th layer on top of these mountains, and so you don't necessarily have to paint all the way down. It's really up to you. So for this one, I'm going to go to about right here, and we'll call it good. So again, same process. I got to let this layer dry before I paint on my final layer. And so we'll go ahead and speed this up, and I'll be right back once it's dry. For the last layer. So remember again, we are creating different layers that progressively get darker, and so the last one is going to be the darkest. So of course, in the well that you've already created, you can simply just grab more paint of the color that you're using and then add it to the well. So since we need more paint than water, clearly we're not going to add any water unless you have to activate your paints. But again, more paint is going to be necessary just to create a darker layer. So before I paint, it'd be a good idea just to double check and make sure that I have a dark enough hue, right? And so that should be perfect. So again, with my last layer, remember again, each layer has to be dry before you paint the next. And so this layer is completely dry and perfect. It is just dark enough to make a huge difference between the ones that are already there. So here, of course, again, you're drawing your last layer of mountains, and remember that mountains, you know, they're very unique. They have really interesting lines, and so as you're doing this, remember again, there is no right or wrong. So whatever you feel Looks correct, go for it. So for this one, of course, I'm painting all the way down to the page because it is going to be my last layer. With each layer before, you totally could have painted all the way down, but you know, it isn't technically necessary because again, each layer is going to cover up the bottom half of what was there before. So once it's painted, of course, we have completed atmospheric perspective. And again, anytime that you're trying to create some depth in your artwork, anything that is the furthest away is your lightest layer, and anything that is closest to you would be your darkest layer. Alright. Alright guys, we're almost there. Next up is going to be splatter drip. So exactly as it sounds, we are going to experiment with doing some splatters and some drips. And so this effect or this technique is, you know, very interesting and very unique because of obvious reasons, right? The result for this is going to be different every single time, and there's a few different ways to approach it. So the first thing that we're going to do, of course, as always, we're going to pick which square we want to do it in. I think I'm going to do mine in a smaller square, but of course, remember, you can do yours wherever you'd like. And so here what we're going to be doing is we're going to be splattering and dripping in this square. So remember, watercolor is all about control, and so here, when I'm splattering, as you can imagine, splatter is going to go all over your page, right? And so just to be safe, we're going to go ahead and use a piece of paper towel, and I like to fold mine in half, and then we're just going to kind of just set it up against where the line is for our blocked out section. Now again, you want to do this just so you can have optimal control and not have to worry about any of your paint dripping or splattering into your other sections. Again, so that we can make sure that it's only within this square here. So when we are experimenting with this particular method, splattering and dripping, of course, selection of paintbrush is going to matter. All of them are going to do well. I myself am going to use this bigger round brush, but you know, I encourage you to just kind of get a feel for what each paintbrush does. So throughout this, we'll go ahead and experiment with different paintbrushes. So here, right now, my page is dry, and we're just going to go ahead and jump right in, and we're going to experiment with having it dry and then just kind of splattering on there. Now, the initial, so we're going to take our brush and we're going to take our finger and we're going to kind of just flick it up against our finger and flick it down. Now, a lot of you are going to want to, you know, distinctly or by nature just kind of flick with your brush like this. You don't want to do that because that's going to cause havoc. It's going to go all over the place, probably going to hit your neighbor, and that's something that we don't want to do. So we want to have controlled splatters, and so we want to just use our finger and just kind of flick it up against and kind of have it a little bit more closer to the page. So here, right, it matters how pigmented how much paint you have on your brush, right? Because of the same effect, if you have a little bit of paint, more water, your splatters are going to appear and look a lot more transparent. Okay? And then I went back in and added a little bit more paint, and then now we have some more bigger, more darker splatters. So with this, again, I want you guys to just play around with color. See what happens. Again, this is all about, you know, exploring and experimenting. And the beauty about this is that we will have many different outcomes. And so every single piece that you do is going to be unique and different. So here I'm just, again, dipping into different colors. I am holding it up against my finger like this, and I am just kind of splattering it down. So as you see, it's getting all up on my desk, which it's watercolor and a wipe off. So if you want to kind of help yourself not have such a big cleanup, you can definitely put a paper towel kind of right there too, just to catch all of the excess splatter. I'm going to do a couple more colors. So making sure that you have enough water and paint on your brush is going to set you up for success in making sure that there is enough to splatter onto the page. as you can imagine, if we don't have very much paint or water on our brush, we're not going to get very much effect. So I've been doing splatters, and now I'm going to do some drips. So to be successful at drips, we really want to make sure that the color on our palette is, pretty well saturated. And once we pick up, we want to have enough on our brush that it's going to drip naturally. So here, I don't have enough water, so I'm going to keep grabbing, and then we're just going to kind of just let it drip onto our page, right? And so again, the more water, the more successful you'll be here. And so I'm holding it like this, right, pinching it, and then I'm using my middle finger just to kind of tap so that all of the water from the brush drips down onto the page. So the difference between drip and splatter, of course, as you can imagine, drips are going to give you bigger kind of drops of color. Splatter is going to give you that really fine kind of, splatter on your page. And so as I'm working through, again, I'm just playing around, I'm experimenting, I'm seeing what happens when I, take a lot of water, a little bit of water, a lot of paint, a little bit of paint, and we're just seeing what happens. And so here, the only goal that you're going to have is to fill the entire page with nothing but drips and splatters. So I'm going to continue. I'm going to speed this up, and we'll be back. And here we are. Splatter and drip. So again, as you see, it is kind of messy, but again, we want to make sure that we have as much control as we possibly can. So again, adding these paper towels around the square to make sure that it is fully controlled is going to be your best outcome. Again, if it does get kind of a little bit more on your desk over here, it's not a big deal. It does wipe right off because remember, again, they're watercolors. But you want to try your best to make sure that you keep it as controlled as possible so that you don't have any of these issues. Now, when you're done, there's going to be big blobs of water because, of course, the drips kind of went on the page and they did, they're kind of sitting there heavy. So you got to just be careful and allow it to dry. So when you carry this to the drying rack, if it's not dry by the end of class, you've got to be very cautious and make sure that these big droplets don't just drip off the page and then ruin all of the nice, interesting work that you've created. Alright guys, we made it, the very last one, number 10, drawing gum. So as I mentioned before, we have many different ways and possibilities of blocking something out. Okay, so blocking something out, as again you can imagine, is very important because of course we are trying our best to control watercolor, and we've learned that watercolor does kind of what it wants if we do not control it, right? And so if there was a moment where I needed to, just as this, create specific sections, we have to understand the materials that we can use to block certain things out. So here, as you see, again, we have tape to block things out. We previously used clear wax or wax resist to block specific things out so we can create different effects. And for this last section, we are going to use drawing gum to block out and kind of control our watercolor. So here, again, drawing gum can be used for many different things. Let's say, for example, you were painting over these shapes and you wanted to preserve the heart. You didn't want to paint on the heart. What you could do is you could paint drawing gum over the heart, and then everything that you paint on top of it will not touch or go into the heart. And so again, it allows you to have really good control. And then of course, if you want to, you can create really cool effects, which we are going to do for our example today. So the first thing that you're going to do is, of course, you are going to grab the drawing gum out of your art kit. Now, the drawing gum is going to be that blue vial that says drawing gum on it. And the way that you use this is kind of just like paint, right? So you're going to lightly shake it just to make sure that any of the sediment at the bottom has reincorporated into the vial. And then of course you're going to open it up. Now when you open it up, there's going to be some bubbles. That's totally fine. You're going to set it aside, and you just got to be very careful, of course, with the vial and making sure that you don't knock it over and whatnot. So again, when you're using drawing gum, you're going to use a paintbrush, but the key with the paintbrush is that you've got to make sure that you rinse off the paintbrush right away after you've used the brush, because of course if you leave the drawing gum on it, essentially it's going to dry and it's going to turn into this kind of rubbery substance, and then it's going to ruin the brush. So again, speaking of rubbery substance, that's exactly what drawing gum is. It is a solution that dries like a piece of rubber, and again, that rubber temporarily sticks to your paper to block out any unwanted watercolor going to that specific area. So again, today we're going to practice using drawing gum by creating this kind of really interesting effect. And so the first thing that you need to do is dip your paintbrush into the drawing gum, and then what we're going to do is we're just going to, paint down some circles and just some shapes on the page. So as you're painting, it's important to note that you need at least one coat of drawing gum in order for it to work. Now, in some cases, the coat might be very thin and very light, and if that is the case, then I suggest painting over it one additional time just in case to make sure that everything is perfect. But for this effect, we are going to be layering up many colors, and again using drawing gum to create different textures, if you will, on your work. So again, you're going to paint just some shapes and some marks on the page, and once you are painted, we're going to have to let the drawing gum dry, excuse me. And so the drawing gum is going to take a good couple of minutes for it to dry. So once you get your first layer down, just go ahead and stop, wash your brush, because again, remember, when you use it, you have to get it washed immediately, or else the drawing gum will stick to the brush, and we do not want that. Of course, when the drawing gum dries, all of this sticky, rubbery substance will dry onto the brush, and that is something that we do not want. Okay? So again, just make sure that you wash your brush off, and that you immediately dry it off, trying to get all of the blue drawing gum off of your brush. So again, like I said, once it's painted, you have to let it dry. It's going to take a couple minutes, and so I'm going to go ahead and speed this up, and we'll be right back when it dries. So my next layer is dry. The drawing gum, of course, is already dry, and then now the paint is dry. So as again I mentioned, drawing gum is going to be blocking out any of whatever is underneath it. So here we have just pure white, and then of course we put some drawing gum down, and then we paint it over yellow. So to remove the drawing gum, you're going to take your eraser, and you're just going to erase the drawing gum. I found that it helps if you just go the same direction, so I'm just erasing. Every time I erase, I just keep going down, 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 and that tends to be the easiest way. But of course, if you erase in the traditional fashion, that works too. So as I'm erasing, you will see that it blocked out exactly as I painted, and so as you'll see, drawing gum is the best thing to use for precision, for detail, for very specifics. And so since it paints just kind of like paint, you have really, really, really strong control of what you're trying to block out. So here, again, if you're looking for detail, so again, let's say if I was going to block out like this square, I would use drawing gum and go over the square, because you are able to get extreme precision with a very nice fine paintbrush. Wax resist, however, it blocks out, but it doesn't do as great of a job as drawing gum. So again, it just depends on what kind of effect you're going for, and really the name of the game here is to have many options. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to speed this up, and I'm going to get rid of all my drawing gum, and I'll show you guys what to do next. Okay, so I have removed all of my drawing gum, and again, we are able to see that it blocked it out very precise, very specific of wherever I painted. And so again, we are going to be going for this really interesting kind of layered effect. And so I'm going to do this about 3 times. So again, I did my first layer with one color and one set of sections for drawing gum. I'm going to go in and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint and draw these shapes again on top of each other. So before you do this, remember that you're going to take your brush, make sure that it is completely dry. Drawing gum doesn't react too well with water. And so again, we're going to kind of do the same exact thing. I'm going to dip in, take my brush, and I'm going to paint new shapes, and I'm going to intentionally overlap some of the sections that I have already painted. So again, as you're painting, try to intentionally overlap with some of the shapes that are already there that we previously blocked out, because again, this is going to give us that really interesting layered kind of textured water effect. So I'm going to get this painted, let it dry, and then I'll show you guys the next step. So now my second go at drawing gum is dry, and so since it's dry, I'm going to paint on my next layer. Remember, for me, I'm using warm colors, up to you of whatever colors that you want to use. However, again, our goal is to paint the entire section one more time, and it is totally okay that it is being painted over this yellow, because again, all of the areas that I blocked out are going to retain the yellow that's already there, and it's going to create, again, a really interesting, super funky looking type of design. So I'm going to get this painted, and then we speed it up. Now that the orange that I painted down is nice and dry, I'm going to do the same exact process. I'm going to erase the drawing gum off, and then we'll do it one more time, and we'll have our very interesting layered effect. So I'm going to speed this up, I'm going to remove the drawing gum, and then I'll be right back. Alright guys, the final stretch, on the last layer. So we're going to do this process one more time where we paint on the drawing gum and then go ahead and do one more layer of color. But I want you guys to kind of take note of what's happening here. Right? So when we kind of look a little bit closer to our work, we start to see these really interesting layers that we initially blocked out and then blocked out again, and then of course we'll do it one more time. So when I put my drawing gum on for the last time, again, just like the last time, I'm going to intentionally overlap. Now notice how there's different layers that you have going on here, and so when you're overlapping for the last time, just think about what is there and what you want to save and preserve and what you want to kind of paint over. Remember that the more things that you save and the more interesting layers that you're able to come up with, the more interesting the outcome is going to be. So as you're painting on your drawing gum, kind of keep that into consideration of where you're going to paint and what you're going to keep, and then of course what is going to be painted over. So again, like I said, I'm going to go ahead and paint my layer of drawing gum, and then I'll paint my layer of paint. We'll let it dry, and then I'll erase, and we'll come back for the final product. Remember, don't forget to let your drawing gum dry before you paint your next layer. Alright guys, now that my paint is dry, of course I'm going to go ahead and remove the drawing gum to reveal our wonderful final product. So I'm going to speed this up, erase it, and then we'll come right back. Alright guys, and like that, we are done. So again, if you look close, you can see some really cool, interesting patterns going on. And again, this can, would be very difficult to replicate otherwise. And so drawing gum has some very strong effects and very useful effects that you can use for anything that you're creating. So as you go through and as we have completed our technique sheet, when you start creating your own works, think about how these techniques can be incorporated into whatever you make with watercolor and how you can take it to that next level with anything that you're creating. Removing your tape, you can just peel it off like you normally would. However, there is a really good method and way that you can remove your tape without damaging the paper. So yes, you pre-stuck your tape, but sometimes if you just kind of pull it off, it'll rip some of the page just because, again, the sticky adhesive, it's just sticky, right? So what I like to do, so instead of just pulling, right, like you normally would, right, it's better if you pull up just a little bit and you fold it down and then you kind of pull back while it's really close to the page. So I like to kind of just pull the tape as it is, like with my finger as I'm pushing down on the page, so that the tape is as close to the paper as possible, and it's going to prevent it from ripping any of that page that's there. So here, the last step will be to removing the tape to show all of your beautiful work.